Acolyte, a Tombstone fanfiction written by Epi Cat, read by Jukebox Straws. Chapter 1. Doc found that living in Tombstone without the threat of the cowboys lurking ever-present in the dark crevices of the town was downright refreshing. While he was never quite afraid of them, not even when he was dying at the hands of Ike Clanton, he was sure as hell annoyed by them. A lot. And often. His new deal with the devil was also almost pleasant. While he was never called away on a weekly basis to places scattered across the developing West, he was occasionally tugged toward areas nearby enough that he wouldn't be missed for too long. And thankfully, this close to the border in Arizona, there weren't a whole lot of people part of the population attempting to make deals. In his boredom, a few months after everything went down, Doc decided to open another dentistry practice within town. It was mostly a front for any tired townsperson to come sell their everlasting soul, but occasionally an uninformed passerby would drift through his clinic, and he'd just grin with sharp teeth and get to work. As much fun as being the devil's plaything was, not, though the benefits to being immortal were certainly nice, he did, once upon a time, enjoy the profession he spent years of schooling to pursue. Even with all these new activities taking up his days, they still left Doc with ample time to spend with Wyatt, and even Morgan sometimes, though rarely Virgil, more so since the birth of his daughter was getting closer with each week. Allie was heavily pregnant, and anyone with working eyes could see just how tightly wound Virgil was at any moment. While not formally taking time off from his position, he spent any moment he wasn't absolutely needed with Allie, and practically bit off the head of anyone who attempted to move him. Doc could tell Allie found it amusing more than anything, and he always tried to sneak her a wink when Virgil's back was turned. Living with Wyatt was nice. Beyond nice, really. But Doc found himself floundering on how he could describe how incredibly happy he was on the average day. While Kate still technically lived with them, she more or less spent most of her time in Josephine's lodgings, who decided quite randomly that she didn't care to move on from Tombstone. So off went the rest of her troop, leaving behind only Josephine with a suspiciously Kate-sized shadow always lurking behind her. The middle of summer happened to be Doc's favorite time of year, for the sole reason that it wasn't dark as long. Business usually petered out in the summer months, giving him relative peace, even more now that his stipulations had been lessened. Though it usually evened out in about January by the amount of poor, depressed people desperately begging for better things. So it was only with some mild surprise that Doc found the pull of a summons occurring a few counties over on his night walk home from the Oriental. Wyatt had decided to stay behind a little longer to keep an eye on things while Joyce closed up, but Doc was hungry, and he knew there was a bit of stew left in the pot back home. He was aware of the fact that he didn't have to walk the full distance there, but it was peaceful to do it, with the air nice and cool and the stars shining bright above. Pausing in the middle of the road, he found himself fully contemplating just how much trouble he'd get in if he ignored these summons just once. His answer was the tug in his chest getting stronger, causing him to let out an irritated cough. He grimaced. With a fleeting hope that he'd be back home before Wyatt noticed he was missing, he followed the tug with a weary sigh. The moment he appeared at the center of the crossroads he'd been summoned to, a bad feeling settled deep within his bones. Frowning, he looked up and found his frown deepening at the sight of 4 men. He could smell the holy water on them, even from his distance, and the blessed iron somewhere around was making his skin itch. "Gentlemen, what a fine night it is to make a deal," he drawled, trying to hide his unease behind the slow crawl of his smile. "How could I be of service to such eclectic characters such as yourself?" The one closest to Doc, obviously the leader by the way all the other men's eyes darted to him at Doc's words, stepped forward with an easy smile, though his eyes were glinting dangerously. Doc didn't appreciate seeing his own strategy used against him. "You must be Doc Holliday," he mused, stepping even closer until he was an arm's length away. Doc made an attempt to step back. The blessed iron was causing the burn in his lungs to verge on a cough, but found an impenetrable wall at his back. Instantly, Doc's hackles were raised, the iron, the holy water, the trap that he only now noticed beneath his feet. All that atop the fact that they were armed to the teeth like any bounty hunter, but with more exotic tastes. These men were hunters. Tilting his head, Doc bared his teeth in an uneasy grin before saying, "Nice to know my reputation has reached such circles as yours. You have yet to answer my own question, though." He narrowed his eyes. "And I don't much like being disrespected, you know." The lead hunter laughed, though his eyes never crinkled shut. They stayed locked on Doc's caged form as the three other men slowly began to circle him. "What we want ain't much," the man finally admitted, mirth still dancing in his eyes. Doc felt he wouldn't like the answer to his question, suddenly. "But me and my men, well, killing demons and the like don't pay much. We don't get to put down roots enough to get women. Got some steam to let out. Figured we'd grab the biggest crossroad demon this side of the deadline. Rough him up a little," he said, smiling big enough that the yellow of his teeth was distinct. The lead in his stomach was almost more distracting than all the iron around him. With how close all four of them were getting, the cough that had been building couldn't be held back anymore, and he hacked raggedly into his sleeve, blood catching on his lips. Quite abruptly, he began to feel real fear. With Ike, he'd been stabbed by a normal steel blade. Other than the annoyance of having to explain his failures to the devil and the whole hassle of being shoved back into his body, he hadn't really been scared. But now, the men around him clearly had no intention of letting him live, and by the sound of it, his way of getting there would be painful. He didn't even have the hope that they could botch killing him, because now he could tell that the bullets in their guns were blessed iron, as well as the knives hanging off their belts. "And just what does that entail?" Doc asked, wary, eyes darting between each of the four men. The mention of women in regards to what they would do to him didn't bode well. The hunter tilted his head while the other three men laughed nervously. Clearly, they were still scared of him, despite him being contained. It made him feel less like a caged rabbit and more like a caged tiger. But a cage was still a cage, and its master could be just as cruel to either beast. "Oh, don't you worry about your delicate sensibilities. We ain't that far into degeneracy. Unlike you, we do have some morals," he drawled, clearly enjoying the hunted look that Doc wasn't quite able to hide. He cast a fleeting thought toward Wyatt, hoped the man wouldn't wait up too late for him, hoped he would send out the cavalry once he realized what had happened. Before Doc could get in another word, the hunter jerked his head towards the men closest to him. "Knock him out. We've got to get out of here before his pet marshal comes running." The dread didn't even have time to fully form when a cloth soaked in holy water was being pressed over his nose and mouth. Instantly, burning agony ripped through him, a hacking cough filled with blood spilled out, another one following, and another several after that, each ratcheting up the searing pain in his lungs. It wasn't long before it all became too much, and he went slack against the man against him, soon unaware and decidedly not looking forward to when he woke up. Wyatt spent most of his walk home wondering if Doc had left any stew for him, or if the secret glutton had eaten it all, knowing Wyatt would be forced to eat the old hard tack at the back of their pantry. Walking down the silent, dark road, he tried to ignore the faint whispering he had strained to hear, or the edges of shadows flickering around outside the corner of his eye. Once he was home, he could draw the curtains on them until Doc drifted off to sleep. Then he'd start his nightly vigil. He was quietly grateful that Doc was such a heavy sleeper, even though the man was well aware of Wyatt's activities. It didn't take all that long until the house came into view, though what he found a little curious was the distinct lack of lighting. Normally, if he managed to stay out later than Doc, the house would be lit up nice and bright for Wyatt, a veritable beacon in the middle of the empty desert just outside the faint lights of Tombstone. He thought for a moment that perhaps Doc had gone to sleep already, but the idea didn't sit right with him. Doc always waited up for him, even if he was drifting off in one of the chairs in the kitchen, lamp flickering brightly beside him. An uneasy feeling began to settle in his stomach, and his once confident steps faltered a little. Shaking his head, he retained his former cadence with an annoyed grimace. If something was wrong, putting it off by a couple seconds wouldn't make a difference. Perhaps he'd done something to earn Doc's ire, he thought, half desperate. They parted at the Oriental in good spirits, and Wyatt couldn't imagine there was anything in the house to truly piss Doc off in such a short amount of time. He'd even thrown his dirty clothes in the bin this time, for God's sake. Cresting the steps of the porch, he went for the knob, but found it still locked. They'd only even installed it by Doc's decree, as he wouldn't put it past any of the victims of his former deals to attempt to get back at him. Wyatt hadn't had the strength to disagree, nor did he really want to. Staring at the locked door with the lights left unlit, dread began to envelop him. Maybe he was summoned off, he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize things while he fished out his half-forgotten key and unlocked the door, quietly stepping in. With a nervous swallow, he lit a lantern and wandered back to their room, staring down at the empty bed. It seemed there would be no one to keep him company on his watch that night. As he sat on the chest placed beneath the window for this very purpose, eyes wide and searching, he said to himself resolutely, "If he's not back by the morning, I'll go looking." However, even as he said it, he was already making plans for what he'd be doing the following morning. He wanted so desperately for his suspicions to be wrong. God, did he want it. But the weight in his stomach and bones did not lend much credence to a positive outcome. Unfortunately, it seemed he was right. Doc did not appear by the next morning. Stomach churning so badly that he ended up skipping breakfast, he wasted no time in going to find the posse that helped him with the cowboys a few months prior. Looked like he had an errant demon to track down. To be continued in Chapter 2.